I smiled, and then I asked a question that made my daughter-in-law stop mid-sentence, her wine glass hovering just inches from her lips. The Christmas lights reflected softly off the polished hardwood floors, casting warm golden patterns across the living room I had lived in for over 30 years, the same room where I had once hosted laughter, birthdays, and quiet Sunday mornings. Yet that evening, sitting in my own armchair, I felt like a guest who had arrived too early or stayed too long. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, and Bing Crosby's voice drifted gently from the speakers, filling every corner with a kind of manufactured comfort, the kind that looks perfect from the outside, but feels hollow if you listen too closely. My son Daniel stood near the fireplace, nodding along to something his wife was saying, his posture relaxed, his attention entirely hers, as if the rhythm of the room now followed her voice instead of mine. Sophia moved through the space like she had memorized it better than I ever had, directing where the platters should go, adjusting the seating without asking, greeting guests at the door before I could even stand up, her smile polished and confident, the kind of smile that suggested ownership rather than gratitude. "Let's keep the gifts in the dining room this year," she said casually, as if traditions were flexible things that could be rearranged like furniture, and everyone listened, even Daniel, even the guests who used to look to me for those decisions. I folded my hands in my lap and watched, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing the quiet shift that had somehow already happened without my permission. A few weeks earlier, I had noticed small things, things that didn't seem important at the time, like the spare key missing from the kitchen drawer, or the way the guest room had been rearranged without anyone mentioning it to me, or how Sophia had started answering questions that were clearly meant for me, her voice always just a little too quick, a little too certain. Back then, I told myself it was nothing, that families change, that younger people bring new energy, that I should be grateful for the help. But sitting there on Christmas Eve, watching her lift my serving tray like it belonged to her, I felt something settle quietly in my chest, not anger, not sadness, but clarity. I realized I didn't recognize the structure of my own home anymore, not the physical walls, but the invisible lines of authority, of decision, of belonging. When did those lines move, and how had I not seen it happen? I glanced toward the hallway where my bedroom door stood slightly ajar, the same room I had slept in since my husband passed, the one place that still felt untouched, and for a moment, I wondered if even that space had already been decided for me without my knowledge. Sophia laughed at something one of the guests said, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, and he smiled back at her in a way that felt distant, like a memory of the boy who used to ask me what time dinner would be. I leaned back into the chair, letting the soft glow of the tree lights blur slightly as I exhaled. And then, without raising my voice, without changing my expression, I spoke, my words quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear them. "Sophia, when exactly did my house stop being mine?" No one answered me right away, and that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because it was not confusion, it was hesitation, the kind that comes when people realize something has been noticed that was never meant to be seen. And I watched Sophia carefully as she lowered her glass, just a little too slowly, her smile still in place, but her eyes searching Daniel's face as if waiting for him to step in and fix it for her. But he did not. He simply cleared his throat and reached for a napkin that did not need adjusting, a small, unnecessary movement that reminded me of the boy who used to avoid eye contact when he knew he had done something wrong. Except now, he was a grown man standing in my living room pretending not to hear his own mother. I did not repeat the question. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, hands folded, and let the moment stretch, because sometimes the truth reveals itself best when you give it enough space to breathe. And eventually Sophia let out a light laugh, the kind that tries to smooth over something sharp, and she said, "Oh, Margaret, you know what I mean, we are just trying to make things easier for everyone." And she gestured vaguely around the room as if everyone included me, but I noticed she never actually looked at me when she said it. I nodded once, slowly, as if I accepted the answer, even though I did not, because I had learned something important over the years. Arguing too early only gives people time to prepare better lies, and I was not interested in lies anymore. I was interested in understanding. The rest of the evening continued as if nothing had happened. Conversations picked back up, plates were passed around, laughter returned in soft, careful bursts. but everything felt slightly off, like a picture frame hanging just a little crooked on the wall. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I watched how Sophia answered questions before I could, how she redirected conversations, how she referred to plans as decisions that had already been made, and each time, Daniel followed her lead without hesitation, without even glancing in my direction, and that was when I realized this was not something new. This had been building for a while, quietly, gradually, right in front of me. After the guests began to leave and the house settled into that familiar post-holiday quiet, I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing a plate that did not really need rinsing, just to give my hands something to do. And I let my mind move backward through the past few months, replaying moments I had dismissed at the time, the missing key, the rearranged room, the unopened mail that Sophia had casually mentioned she had already sorted, and suddenly those small details did not feel small anymore. They felt connected, like pieces of a pattern I had not been looking for. I dried my hands slowly and glanced toward the counter where the stack of documents usually sat, except it was thinner now, noticeably so, and I could not remember moving anything myself. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not panic, not fear, but a quiet decision forming with absolute clarity. Because if something had been changed, if something had been moved, then it meant there was something to find. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath and thought, I need to see exactly what they think I do not know. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual, not because it was empty, but because something had shifted beneath the surface, like a floorboard that creaks differently once you realize it is loose. And I moved through the kitchen slowly, making my coffee the same way I had for years, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, waiting for the familiar drip, except this time I paid attention to everything, to where things were placed, to what had been moved, to what felt slightly out of alignment with my memory. The sunlight came through the window above the sink, soft and pale, catching the edge of the counter where I used to keep a small stack of unopened mail, and I noticed it was no longer there, not even a trace of it, as if it had never existed. And I stood there for a moment, holding my mug, trying to recall the last time I had personally gone through those envelopes, trying to remember if I had given anyone permission to handle them for me. And the answer came back clear and immediate. I had not. I set the mug down without taking a sip and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, not rushed, because I did not want to alert anyone that I had begun to look more closely. And when I reached the small desk near the living room where I kept my documents, I opened the drawer carefully, expecting to see the usual folders arranged in the same order I had always kept them. But instead I found a subtle difference. The folders were there, but they had been shifted, reorganized in a way that was too neat, too intentional. And for a moment, I simply stared at them, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the drawer as I let that realization settle. I pulled one folder out, then another, flipping through pages that looked familiar at first glance but felt unfamiliar in their arrangement. And then I noticed something that made me pause. A document I did not recognize sitting neatly among my records, its edges crisp, its placement deliberate, as if it had been added recently, but designed to appear as though it had always belonged there. I did not react. I did not let my breathing change. I simply slid the paper out and read the first few lines, my eyes moving steadily across the page, taking in words that felt both distant and uncomfortably personal, references to authority, to permissions, to decisions that could be made on my behalf, and I felt a quiet stillness settle over me, the kind that comes when something you suspected begins to take shape in front of you. I placed the document back exactly where I found it, aligning the edges with care, and closed the drawer gently, because whatever had been done here had been done with the expectation that I would not notice, and that assumption was now the only advantage I had. From the kitchen, I could hear Sophia's voice, light and casual, speaking on the phone as if nothing in the world required careful handling. And I stood there for a moment, listening not to her words but to the ease in her tone, the confidence of someone who believes everything is already under control. And I realized then that this was not going to be solved with confrontation, not yet, because answers given too easily are rarely the truth. I returned to the kitchen, picked up my coffee, now slightly cooled, and took a slow sip, letting the quiet fill the space around me. And in that quiet, I made a decision that felt both simple and absolute. I would not ask another question until I already knew the answer. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I drove myself to the bank without telling anyone where I was going. Not because I needed permission, but because I had grown used to informing someone out of habit. And as I backed out of the driveway, I realized how quietly those habits had formed, how easily independence can be softened into something that looks like consideration but feels like dependence. The streets were calm, the kind of quiet you get the day after Christmas, when decorations are still up but the excitement has already passed. And I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts organized, not scattered, because I was not going there to confirm a fear, I was going there to understand a pattern. When I walked into the bank, the air felt cool and familiar, and the woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile that did not carry any assumptions. And for a moment, I appreciated that more than I expected, because outside of my home, I was still simply Margaret Collins, not someone being quietly managed. I asked to review my accounts, my documents, anything connected to my name, and I made sure my voice remained calm, not urgent, because urgency invites attention, and attention was not what I needed right now. The manager, a man I vaguely recognized from years before, led me into a small office and began pulling up records on his screen, his tone professional, neutral, and as he spoke, I listened carefully, not just to what he said, but to what he did not say. At first, everything sounded normal: balances, dates, transactions, all the expected details presented in a steady rhythm. But then he paused, just slightly, the kind of pause most people would not notice, and I felt it immediately, because once you start looking for patterns, even silence becomes information. He adjusted his glasses and scrolled again, then said, "Mrs. Collins, I see there is a power of attorney on file connected to your accounts." And he said it as if it were a routine matter, something ordinary, something expected, but the words settled differently in my mind, because I had never authorized anyone to make decisions on my behalf. I did not react. I did not interrupt. I simply nodded once, encouraging him to continue, and he explained that the document allowed another party to manage certain financial and property-related decisions if necessary. And as he spoke, I could feel the shape of the situation becoming clearer, not through emotion, but through structure, through language that had been carefully written and quietly implemented. "Who was listed?" I asked, my voice even, and he glanced at the screen before answering. "Sophia Collins." And there it was, not a suspicion anymore, not a possibility, but a fact presented in plain terms. And I let that fact sit with me for a moment, not pushing it away, not reacting to it, just accepting it as part of the reality I now had to understand. I asked to see the document, and when he printed it out and placed it in front of me, I recognized my own signature at the bottom, familiar and precise, exactly as I had written it countless times before, and yet I had no memory of signing this particular paper, no recollection of agreeing to this kind of authority being placed in someone else's hands. I ran my finger lightly along the edge of the page, not to confirm it was real, but to anchor myself in the moment, and then I looked up at the manager and thanked him, as if this were simply a routine check, as if nothing about this discovery had shifted anything inside me, because the truth is, the shift had already happened, not in that office, but the night before, when I realized I needed to stop asking questions out loud and start finding answers quietly. I folded the document carefully, placed it in my bag, and stood up with the same steady posture I had walked in with, because whatever had been set in motion without my awareness was now fully visible. And once something is visible, it can be addressed, but only if you move with patience. And as I walked out of the bank into the cool afternoon air, I understood one thing with complete clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a plan, and I intended to see exactly how far it had gone. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. I simply let the quiet fill the car as I replayed every detail in my mind, not with emotion, but with precision, because what I had seen at the bank was not just a document. It was a structure, something that had been built carefully, step by step, without drawing attention. And I needed to understand how it had been put together before I decided how to take it apart. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The wreath still hanging on the front door, the lights still wrapped around the porch railing, everything in its place, and yet I knew now that appearances were no longer something I could trust. I walked inside and was immediately met with the soft hum of conversation, Sophia's voice drifting from the living room, light and confident, discussing plans for the upcoming week, mentioning schedules, appointments, decisions that sounded as if they had already been finalized, and I paused just long enough to listen, not to interrupt, but to observe. Because I was beginning to understand that information was not something given freely in this house anymore. It was something revealed in pieces if you knew how to listen for it. "We will take care of that," she said, and that word again, we, used so casually, so comfortably, as if it naturally included authority, and I stepped into the room with a small smile, the same calm expression I had worn the night before, and both she and Daniel looked up at me, their faces relaxed, unaware of what I now knew. "Everything all right?" Daniel asked, his tone easy, and I nodded, setting my bag down by the chair, careful not to draw attention to it, careful not to signal that anything had changed, because the truth is, everything had changed, just not for them yet. "I went out for a bit," I said simply, and Sophia smiled, a polite, practiced expression that did not quite reach her eyes, and replied, "You should have told me. I could have helped with whatever you needed." And I met her gaze for a brief moment, not challenging, not confrontational, just steady, and said, "I did not need help," before moving past her into the kitchen. I placed the folded document from the bank inside a drawer I knew had not been touched, a place I had not used in years, and as I closed it, I realized something that felt almost surprising in its clarity. I was no longer reacting to what they were doing, I was observing it. And there is a difference between the two. One keeps you in their story, the other allows you to step outside of it. Over the next few hours, I paid attention to everything. To the way Sophia moved through the house, to the way Daniel deferred without realizing it, to the way decisions were framed as conveniences rather than changes, and I began to see the pattern more clearly. This was not sudden. This was not accidental. This was gradual control presented as helpful involvement, authority introduced in small, reasonable steps until it no longer felt like authority at all. That evening, as I sat in my room with the door closed, I took out the document again and read it more carefully, line by line, not rushing, not skimming, because every word mattered. Every clause had been chosen for a reason, and the more I read, the more I understood that this was not just about access to accounts. This extended further into decisions about property, about management, about actions that could be taken without my direct involvement. And I let that realization settle without panic, because panic clouds judgment, and judgment was the only thing I needed right now. I folded the paper again and placed it back in the drawer, then sat quietly for a moment, my hands resting in my lap, my thoughts steady, and I asked myself one simple question, not out loud, not for anyone else to hear, but for myself alone. How much do they think I do not know? Because the answer to that question would tell me exactly how they planned to proceed, and more importantly, how I would respond. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already settled into a kind of quiet focus that did not allow for drifting, and I moved through my routine with the same steady pace, making breakfast, opening the curtains, letting the winter light fill the room. Except this time, I was not moving out of habit. I was moving with intention, noticing where things were placed, how the house functioned, who moved through it, and how. Sophia came downstairs shortly after, her phone already in her hand, her expression composed, efficient, and she greeted me with that same polite warmth she always used, the kind that sounds kind but never quite feels personal. And as she poured herself coffee, she said, "I was thinking we should start organizing some of the paperwork this week, just to keep things streamlined." And I nodded lightly, as if the idea were new, as if I had not already seen what she meant by organizing. "That sounds like a good idea," I replied, my voice calm, my tone agreeable, because agreement, I was learning, was far more useful than resistance at this stage. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, glancing between us as if trying to read something he could not quite name, but he said nothing, and that silence confirmed something I had begun to suspect. He was not leading any of this. He was following it. Throughout the morning, I allowed the day to unfold naturally, or at least as naturally as it appeared, listening to conversations, observing small decisions, noting how often Sophia spoke on behalf of both of them, how easily. She positioned herself at the center of every plan, and each time I responded the same way, with quiet acceptance, with no indication that anything had changed on my end, because the moment they realize you are aware is the moment they begin to adjust, and I needed them to continue exactly as they had been. By midday, I stepped out again, this time under the simple explanation of running errands, and I drove to a small office downtown, one I had not visited in years, but one I remembered clearly, the law office my husband and I had once used when we first set up our estate documents. And as I walked inside, the familiarity of the space felt grounding, not comforting, but steady, like returning to a place where things are defined clearly, where words mean exactly what they say. The attorney who greeted me was not the same man from years ago, but he had access to the same records, the same history, and when I explained that I needed to review any legal documents connected to my name, he did not question me. He simply began pulling files, and I watched as he worked, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my thoughts focused not on what I felt, but on what I needed to confirm. When he placed the documents in front of me, I saw it again, the same structure I had seen at the bank, the same language, the same authority granted in careful, measured terms, and this time, I read it with context, understanding not just what it said, but what it allowed, and more importantly, what it assumed, that I would not question it, that I would not notice it, that I would not challenge it. This can be revoked, the attorney said quietly, pointing to a section I had not fully considered before, and I looked at him, not surprised, but attentive, because that single sentence shifted something important, not in the situation itself, but in my position within it. I nodded once, taking in the information, and asked what steps would be required. And as he explained the process, I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory, not rushing, not reacting, because this was no longer about discovery. This was about preparation. When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, colder, but clearer, and as I walked to my car, I realized something with complete certainty. They believed they had already secured control. They believed the decisions had already been made, and that belief was exactly what would allow me to take it back without them seeing it coming. When I returned home that afternoon, I did not go straight inside. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at the front of the house the same way I had looked at documents earlier, not as something familiar, but as something to be understood, and I realized that what had once felt like a place of comfort had quietly become a place of assumption, where decisions were being made in my name without my awareness. And that realization no longer unsettled me. It clarified me. I stepped out, closed the door gently, and walked inside with the same calm expression I had worn all week, because nothing on the surface needed to change yet. Sophia was at the dining table with a laptop open, papers spread neatly in front of her, and Daniel stood beside her, leaning slightly as if trying to follow along. And the moment I entered, Sophia looked up with that same composed smile and said, "Perfect timing. We were just going over a few things that might need your attention." And the way she said, "your attention," felt carefully chosen, as if she were offering me involvement in something that had already been structured without me. I set my coat down and walked over slowly, not hesitating, not rushing, just present, and glanced at the papers without immediately focusing on the details. Because sometimes the first thing people reveal is not what is written, but how they expect you to respond to it. "We thought it would be easier if everything was organized under one system," she continued, her voice smooth, confident, and Daniel nodded slightly beside her, not adding anything, just reinforcing her words with his agreement, and I noticed how natural that dynamic had become, how effortless it looked from the outside. I pulled out a chair and sat down, folding my hands lightly on the table, and said, "Walk me through it." My tone neutral, open, and she did, explaining structures, efficiencies, ways to simplify management, each sentence carefully framed to sound helpful, reasonable, beneficial, and I listened without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I already understood the foundation beneath her explanation. As she spoke, I recognized the language, the same phrases I had seen in the documents, the same ideas presented in softer terms, and I let her finish completely before responding, because people often reveal more when they believe they have successfully convinced you. "That sounds very organized," I said, giving her exactly the response she expected, and I saw the brief flicker of satisfaction in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, the confirmation she had been waiting for, and in that moment, I understood something important. She believed this was already settled. Daniel exhaled slightly, as if relieved, and reached for one of the papers, sliding it a little closer to me. We just need to finalize a few details, he said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, and I nodded again, not touching the paper, not asking questions, just observing how easily they moved forward when they thought there was no resistance. The conversation shifted after that, lighter topics, small plans, everyday things, and I allowed it, participating just enough to maintain the rhythm, because disruption at the wrong moment would only create awareness, and awareness was still not what I needed from them. Later that evening, as the house settled into quiet again, I sat alone with my thoughts, not replaying what had happened, but mapping what would happen next, because now I had both pieces, what they had done and what they believed I would do. And between those 2 points was the only space that mattered, the space where I could act without being anticipated. I did not feel anger. I did not feel urgency. I felt something far more useful, control returning in small, precise increments. And as I turned off the light and let the room fall into darkness, I understood that the advantage was no longer theirs. It was simply waiting to be used. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that would have looked ordinary to anyone else. But to me, every small detail carried weight. Every interaction became a point of confirmation, and I moved through them all with the same steady calm I had chosen from the beginning, because consistency was the one thing they would not question. I agreed to everything they suggested, every meeting, every review of documents, every small adjustment they presented as helpful, and with each agreement, I watched their confidence grow, watched how easily they interpreted my silence as acceptance, my cooperation as trust, and I realized that the more predictable I appeared, the less they felt the need to be cautious. One morning, Sophia mentioned that it would be efficient to consolidate certain accounts, to simplify access, and I nodded, asking just enough questions to seem engaged, but never enough to suggest resistance. And she explained everything again with that same composed clarity, unaware that I already understood every word she was saying, not just the explanation, but the intention behind it. Daniel sat beside her, occasionally adding a comment, occasionally glancing at me as if seeking reassurance, and I gave it to him, small, calm acknowledgments that kept him comfortable, because his comfort was part of the structure she relied on. That afternoon, while they were both out, I made the call I had already planned, speaking with the attorney again, confirming each step, each requirement, each timeline, and I followed those steps carefully, not rushing, not skipping anything, because the strength of what I was doing depended entirely on precision. Documents were prepared, signatures were scheduled, notifications were arranged, all in a way that would not trigger immediate alerts, all in a sequence that allowed the changes to take effect quietly, just as their actions had been implemented quietly before. When I returned to the house that evening, nothing looked different. The same lights, the same furniture, the same arrangement of things, and yet I knew that beneath that surface, the structure had already begun to shift back, not dramatically, not visibly, but steadily, and that was exactly how it needed to happen. Sophia greeted me with her usual warmth, asking about my day, offering to go over a few more details later, and I agreed, my tone unchanged, my expression relaxed, because there was no advantage in revealing anything too soon. Over the next few days, I continued the same pattern, listening, observing, allowing them to move forward with their plans, while at the same time, each step they took was quietly met with a counterstep they could not see, permissions being adjusted, authorities being redefined, access being limited in ways that would only become apparent when they tried to use it. I did not confront, I did not accuse, I did not explain, because none of that would have served the purpose. The purpose was not to argue. It was to restore balance, and balance, I had learned, does not return through noise, it returns through control. By the end of the week, everything was in place, every document aligned, every detail accounted for, and as I sat in the living room that evening, the same room where this had all quietly begun, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not satisfaction, but certainty, because the next move would not require preparation, it would only require timing, and timing, unlike everything else, was entirely mine to choose. It happened on a quiet evening, not during a meeting, not during a discussion, but in the middle of something ordinary, which is exactly how I wanted it, because ordinary moments lower defenses in ways that planned conversations never can. Sophia was in the kitchen, reviewing something on her laptop, her posture relaxed, her movements efficient, while Daniel stood nearby scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at her screen as if confirming that everything was proceeding as expected, and I sat in the living room, the same place I had been sitting when all of this first revealed itself to me, watching the scene with the same calm attention I had maintained from the beginning. After a few minutes, Sophia spoke without looking up. "I think we should finalize the remaining account access tomorrow, just to make sure everything runs smoothly moving forward." And Daniel nodded, his agreement automatic, almost reflexive, and I stood slowly, not interrupting, not reacting, just moving toward them with the same measured pace I had used all week. "That sounds efficient," I said, my voice steady, and she glanced up briefly, offering a small smile of acknowledgement before returning her attention to the screen, confident, comfortable, certain that everything was still under her control. I reached the table and placed my hand lightly on the back of the chair, not sitting down, not yet, and for a moment, I simply observed them both, the ease in their expressions, the absence of hesitation, the quiet assumption that nothing would change, and then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly enough to shift the air in the room. "Sophia, would you like me to read the document you had me sign?" The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Her fingers paused above the keyboard, Daniel's. Attention lifted from his phone, and the silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition, the kind that comes when something hidden is brought into the open without warning. I did not move. I did not repeat myself. I simply waited, allowing the weight of the question to settle, because the answer was not what mattered, the awareness was. Sophia closed her laptop slowly, her movements more deliberate now, and said, "I am not sure what you mean," her tone still composed, but no longer as effortless, and I nodded once, acknowledging the response without accepting it. "The power of attorney," I said calmly, watching her expression shift, just slightly, just enough. "The one filed with the bank, the one that allows you to make decisions on my behalf." And Daniel's face changed in a way that felt more honest than anything he had shown all week. Confusion first, then something closer to concern, and he looked at Sophia as if expecting clarification that did not come immediately. I reached into my bag and placed a folded document on the table, smoothing it out with a steady hand, not presenting it as evidence, but as fact, something that simply existed whether they acknowledged it or not. I reviewed everything. I continued, my voice even, controlled, and I have already made the necessary adjustments. And that was the moment the balance shifted, not because of what I said, but because of what they understood, that the structure they believed was secure had already been changed without their awareness, just as they had once done to me. Sophia's expression held, composed but tighter now, her confidence no longer effortless, and Daniel looked between us, trying to piece together a situation he had not fully seen before, and I did not explain further. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice, because none of that was necessary. I stepped back slightly, giving them space not out of retreat, but out of control, and said one final sentence, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. "From now on, I will be handling my own decisions." And then I turned and walked away, leaving the silence behind me, not empty, but full of everything they had not expected to face.